So I was watching Dr. Phil on the David Pakman show, and I never thought I would ever be making a video on Dr. Phil. But during his interview with David Pakman, he said something so over the top and made such a ridiculous analogy that there was no way I could pass this up and not talk about it. They're talking about changing American history, and they're talking about how that we have renamed schools that were originally named after people who had owned slaves. Now, Dr. Phil makes this analogy. I'm going to read to you what he said, and I promise you, real quick, you're going to see the glaring hole in this analogy. Check out what he had to say. He said, "What I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history, to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're driving through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. You guys know where he's going with this. And you drive through the neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and they say, you know what? We're going to change the speed limit to 10. And we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism." So he is comparing speeding, going 10 miles over the speed limit, to owning a slave. That's got to be one of the most ridiculous analogies I've ever heard. Now, I will agree with part of the sentiment of what he's trying to get at. He failed miserably in his analogy, but I understand what he's trying to get at, and I've made the argument in certain cases that no, we shouldn't necessarily hold some people accountable for things that was not acceptable or not acceptable now that was acceptable 100 years ago. Case in point, my great-grandfather was like 26 years old. My great-grandmother was 14. Okay? That's not acceptable today. We've moved past that. We know that that's no longer acceptable. But I'm not going to sit and listen to people say that my great-grandfather groomed my great-grandmother, because my argument would be that my great-grandfather himself was groomed to believe that that's okay. And we've grown past that, and we know that that's not okay now, and we no longer do that. So I understand the sentiment he's getting at here, but we're talking about schools that was named after slave owners, not someone going 10 miles over the speed limit. We're talking about people who took up arms against this country, who tried to divide this country in half, who were traitors to this country. Somewhere along the line, a group of people stood up and said, hey, you know what? We want to name this school after Jefferson Davis, or we want to name this school after Robert E. Lee, or we want to put up this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, that at that particular point in history, that group of people raised up and said, hey, let's name this school after these people, or let's erect this statue for this person. But as time goes on and we look back on what they did in this world, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to continue to honor that? And changing the name of a school or taking down a statue is not erasing history. That's one of the dumbest arguments that I've heard over the years. They're trying to erase history, man. No, we're not. We will continue to talk about Robert E. Lee. We will continue to talk about Jefferson Davis. You know, we will continue to talk about these people. We will continue to talk about what happened and what they've done. But I don't think people like that should be glorified, and they shouldn't, have schools named after them because they have those things in their past. I understand that, yeah, all those years ago, it was legal to own a slave, but it's always been wrong. It's something that was wrong from the first time the idea was ever conceived. And one of the biggest stains, not only on American history, but on human history, is that it took us all these years. It was 1865 before we finally said, hey, that's a bad idea. That's where we're at. So to compare it to the speed limit, going 10 miles over a speed limit, no, it would be absolutely ridiculous to go back and give somebody a ticket that went 10 miles over the speed limit back before it got changed. I agree with you. That would be totally ridiculous. But to compare that to changing the name of schools that was named after slave owners and named after people who did heinous things and took up arms against this country, there's no comparison. But watching that interview, I watch David Pakman all the time, and I love the way he interviews people. I love when he breaks it down. But watching that interview, it just confirmed what I always knew about Dr. Phil. He's not a guy that I ever took seriously. He's not a guy that I would have ever listened to for advice. I always found his show to be comedic relief, to be honest with you. To give you a little peek into my world, I sit and study the news, and I sit and read, and I research things, and I listen to podcasts all day, and I try to educate myself about what's going on in the world. And folks, it's a pretty depressing gig, to be honest with you. Sometimes it feels like the world is burning down around you. So when it's over, my day's over, I'll sit around and I'll listen to Jim Cornette talk about wrestling, because it's just over the top, it's ridiculous, and I can listen to that and just sort of declutter my brain from all the information that I've cranked in there. And I'll sit and watch WWE, or me and my friends will sit and send each other Instagram reels of people crashing on skateboards. Or if Dr. Phil's on, or, Judge Judy or Maury, You Are the Father, I'll sit there and watch that stuff and just have a good laugh, because I'm trying to take my mind off the fact that the world's burning down around me. That's always what Dr. Phil has been to me. He's always just been comedic relief. And after watching that interview and watching him make that analogy and compare going 10 miles over the speed limit to owning a slave, yeah, that's not a guy that I would ever sit and take seriously for a second.